All right, welcome in, everyone. It's time for another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting regarding federal contracting and non-discrimination policies.
Yeah,
And all of this information comes from a report from NPR that we're going to be digging into.
sounds good.
So, yeah, like I said, we're talking about non-discrimination in federal contracting. And I guess the big thing here that we're going to be looking at is this change in how segregation is explicitly prohibited.
Right, and a big piece of this is how it all connects back to an executive order from 1965.
Yeah, that's right. And the NPR report really gets into how a new executive order that came out this past January actually repealed that really important 1965 order from President Lyndon B. Johnson.
Wow.
So yeah, we're going to take a close look at how this change came about and what the potential impacts of it might be. And again, all of this is based on what NPR is reporting.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, so let's jump right in. According to NPR, the federal government no longer explicitly prohibits federal contractors from having segregated facilities.
Thinking about that, you can almost picture it, right? Like separate waiting rooms or even just something as basic as different drinking fountains.
Yeah, that's a powerful image, and the NPR report really makes it clear that this change is a direct result of that executive order that was issued back in January.
Right.
And that order, from what NPR says, the main goal of it was to get rid of all those diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, programs that were under the federal government's watch.
That's a huge shift.
So if we look at the bigger picture, this January order kind of came out of left field, right?
Well, not entirely, I mean.
But it does specifically revoke that 1965 executive order signed by President Johnson, which was a pretty landmark piece of legislation.
Absolutely. That 65 order was really important because it basically forced all federal contracts to include these non-discrimination clauses.
Oh, I see. So it was like a rule book that straight up banned segregation for
Yeah.
anyone who wanted to work with the government.
Yeah, exactly. It was super explicit.
Wow. So basically a long-standing rule with some really clear language about anti-discrimination has been completely undone.
It's a pretty big deal.
Now, this is where things get interesting, because the NPR report goes on to say that things like this, like getting rid of DEI efforts and enacting those tougher immigration policies, all of that is starting to lead to some pretty serious accusations of racism against the Trump administration and Project 2025.
Oh, wow. I see what you mean.
And I know this is a sensitive topic, so I want to be totally clear that we're just reporting on what NPR has said here.
Makes sense.
We're not trying to share our own opinions or take sides politically or anything like that.
Right.
Our only goal is to let you know what's been reported.
I totally get that.
So could you maybe help break down why these particular actions, as NPR reports, are being brought up in this context?
Sure. So what NPR seems to be suggesting is that these actions are being seen by critics as kind of like rolling back all this progress that was made towards equality and inclusion. And that could be a sign that maybe there's a shift away from actively trying to prevent discrimination, not just in federal contracting, but maybe even beyond that.
I see. So it's not just about the specific actions themselves, but what they might represent.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So kind of building on that idea of the repealed order, NPR also brings up this point, and I think it's a really important one. What kind of message does it send to society when these really clear, explicit rules against discrimination are suddenly taken away?
It's almost like a symbolic step backward in a way.
It really makes you think.
Yeah, absolutely. It raises all sorts of questions about what this means for the future.
So just to kind of summarize everything we've talked about, the big takeaway here is that there's no longer a clear federal rule banning segregated facilities for companies that work with the government.
Right.
And this all goes back to that executive order that President Trump signed in January, which basically undid the order that President Johnson put in place back in 1965 about non-discrimination in government contracts.
Yeah, it's definitely a significant shift.
It really is, and it kind of leaves us with this question. How does this all fit into the bigger story of non-discrimination policies in America? What are the potential consequences of these kinds of changes?
It's a really important thing to think about, especially in light of everything that's happening right now with civil rights and federal policy.
Absolutely, and you know what? I think that's a perfect place to leave it for today.
Yeah, I agree.
We've covered a lot of ground, and it's clear that there's still so much more to explore.
I think NPR's reporting really gives us a good starting point, though.
For sure, and we encourage everyone listening to dig deeper into this issue and think critically about what it all means for the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but make sure to check back in with us soon for another in-depth look at the issues that matter most.
See you next time.
Bye, everyone.